So here.
All right, absolutely. All right, thank you, Ed, for the warm welcome, and thank you, everyone. It's quite the turnout. Ed didn't really warn me that there's going to be like bazillion people here. When he reached out originally, he was like, "Hey, can you come over and just, there's going to be a few people here." Like, little did I know, there's probably 100 people here. So I was definitely not expecting that. So, but challenge accepted. So appreciated everyone, and let's go ahead and get started. So Ed reached out, I don't know, probably a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks, and he was like, "Hey, we're doing this, FHIR endpoints lessons learned on the WEDI subgroup, and can you come in and talk a little bit about, what do you have learned, what you've seen in the field?" And I say, "Hey, absolutely. We've learned a lot, and I would be more than happy to come in and share what we have learned, and hopefully others can learn from it. It's all about learning from each other's experience." Can everybody see my screen? I forgot to ask.
We can. Yep.
All right, awesome. Let's see if I can progress here. All right, so let's start a little bit about who I am. You can kind of notice the different spelling in my first name. So that's what Ed was referring. I usually go by Lukasz. Last name, I'm originally from Poland, so my last name is easier to pronounce than you would expect from a Polish last name. Not a lot of T or R, Z's in there, so Lukasz Nosol. You run into you can call me Lukasz or you can call me Lukasz, but when you call me in Polish, you run into the risk of me responding in Polish as well. So you're probably safer to just call me Lukasz. Currently, I sit at Optum, and I'm in a senior director of software development role, where I lead a lot of IT initiative in what we call enterprise clinical integrations and interoperability group at Optum. I specialize in interoperability. I started with healthcare, I want to say 2010 maybe, where I started with EHRs. I worked for Allscripts for a number of years on various different EHRs. And over time, I kind of progressed with Allscripts work on smaller EHRs, bigger EHRs. I also worked on the Allscripts Veradigm business unit when we were sharing data. Everything was related to interoperability and being able to share clinical data or interchange clinical data. Recently at Optum, I've been working on two initiatives that you may have heard. The first, what's called POCA, Point of Care Assist, and that's United Healthcare's solution to share, I would say, insights about members at the point of care. So United Healthcare has a set of APIs that EHRs can integrate, and you can see things like gaps in care, you can do prior authorization, you can do a couple different things using APIs, and those are FHIR-based APIs. And the other significant work that I have done at Optum is we built a platform that allows payers to be compliant with the patient access rule, the 9115 rule that went into effect January 1, 2021. What we have built for UHC as part of Optum has since then been adopted to be used by other payers as well. So we have different, United Healthcare or United Health Group is such a big company that once we build something for one of our biggest clients, we can easily start commercializing on this. And that's what it was with that platform is called, internally we call it Flex. I think the commercial name is slightly different. Flex stands for FHIR Layer Exchange. And that's what we internally call it. And it really is a platform that allows payers to be compliant with that patient access rule. What else about me? I am currently sitting on a care quality steering committee for the past probably 3-4 months. Prior to that, I was sitting on their advisory council, and I also am kind of actively engaged with the Da Vinci group, working along Mike Gold as a co-lead for our architecture group. All right, but that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and get started. So a couple of things. When Ed approached me, I was trying to kind of figure out what are the things that I would want to bring. I know we have like 20 minutes, maybe to half hour. So I decided to maybe focus on top 3 to 5 things that we have learned and I'll run through them. We're gonna spend a couple minutes on each slide, and hopefully then later you guys can ask your questions. So first thing I want to talk about is really the building of the FHIR server. So we adopt and we built our servers ourselves. We didn't go to a vendor. We are in a healthcare IT business. We are a vendor, so we built it ourselves. And the first thing that we kind of had to solve is, how do we build this? Like, do we build it as a facade versus repository-based server? And I'll show you guys in a second, kind of what is the difference and what are the challenges. I really want to focus on the facade challenges that we have seen in our solutions, because it's based from the field, right? So we didn't settle on the repository based. So once I show you the difference between, and I'll walk you through the challenges that we have had, about data access, a little bit about logical patient IDs, and then I'll throw in something on the forensic data tracking, which is not really related to whether it's a facade or repository-based server, but it was an interesting twist that we were kind of given by one of our clients. So first and foremost is like, what are the different ways you can build a FHIR server? So I don't know many of you, so I'm not sure, how deep would you like to get it, but the way you can approach, I'm gonna keep it kind of high level. Maybe in your question sessions, we can maybe dive in a little bit deeper. But at the highest level, like, you can build your FHIR server in two different ways. What we refer to as a facade-based or a repository-based. And it's fundamental to understand the difference, because your design and your implementation will vary greatly based on the approach, and the challenges that you will have are going to be very specific to the path that you choose. So the first one that I have here is the one that I really want to focus on, is the facade based. So what does it mean that I have a FHIR server as a facade? What that really means is that the data is not really stored in the FHIR server per se, but the server, the FHIR server APIs are really just a facade to the systems behind the scene. So that's the top picture here. And I show it that there is only internal non-FHIR system in there with patient data, but a lot of times it's more than just one. Sometimes you have 3, 5, 7 systems, and it could be that maybe claims are one system, maybe your clinical data is different systems, your provider data is in a different system. So keep that in mind, that there could be more than one system in the backend. And your FHIR server that you build, you don't own the data. You just have to connect to the system in the back. So client makes a request, FHIR, the facade server intercepts it, looks at it, and they has to make a decision. Where do I go to get this data? Get the data, come back, potentially map it to FHIR, because the downstream system from you don't have this data in a FHIR format, and then you return. So that orange arrow here means that the data is being returned. So that, in a nutshell, is a facade-based system. And then the repository-based system is slightly different. The data in the FHIR repository-based server actually resides inside the FHIR server. So you have different challenges, because you have to preload your data. So your patient data in this case is basically first inserted into the server, and then when your query gets executed by your client, or when your client makes a query calling, in this case, a patient, your FHIR server has that internal storage. This could be relational, this could be non-relational. It really is up to your implementation. So a lot of vendors that do software as a service, they won't even tell you how this data is. Some of them allow you to maybe pick your own, whether it's relational or not. But the idea is that data stays within the server, and is fundamentally different than the facade-based server, because you don't have this data. Everything is in the back. So keeping that as our foundation, I want to focus a little bit on the challenges of those facade-based systems. So, when we started implementing the patient interoperability access rule, CMS indicated that you shall, it wasn't really required, but it was recommended that you follow a certain implementation guide. So the first thing we've encountered was, let's say we have to share patients' data using US Core. So we go to US Core, we try to implement it here in this FHIR server. Let me bring that, hopefully you can see my cursor. We try to implement this query for a patient, and US Core requires a certain shell query parameters for your resource. So in this case, we're searching by name and a gender. So we start implementing this. Because it's a FHIR server as a facade, we don't own the data, so we have to go down to the downstream system from us and get this data. So when our developers started implementing this, okay, I need to have by name and the gender. We go to the downstream system and we tell them, hey, I need to get this data by name and gender. And they're like, we don't have that way of getting data. You can only get it by the name. Okay, well, what do we do? Right? So the story here is that when you build a facade as a server, you have to really be mindful that the downstream system that you get the data will not always support the paradigm that your FHIR server needs to support for searching of the data. Something that I forgot to mention, I'm focusing mostly on the FHIR server that does the reads. We haven't dealt much with the server that does the writes, simply because we were focusing on the patient interoperability access rule, which is all about reads. So problems that you will see are all mostly related to reading of the data. And when we hit this, like, okay, what do we do, right? Well, the FHIR server needs to be able to produce responses to the queries by name and the gender, but the downstream system doesn't have it. Well, what are the two options? So lesson learned. Well, option one is to really work with this internal non-FHIR system base in the back to go ahead and add this missing query predicate for you. And as easy as it may sound, maybe they can do it, maybe they can't. Maybe they don't have resources, maybe they don't have time. It could be various reasons. If you're in an organization of a reasonable size, different priorities, sometimes it's just not going to happen. So what's your other option? Well, what we have done in the past is, what you have to do is have to pre-cache this data. So is it ideal? Probably not. So what happens? FHIR server queries by name, like the SHA in this case, gets the data, and then internally we filter by this second predicate, which in this case would be all female patients. Now, what you will realize, that's first query is going to be long, second query is going to be long, third query is going to be long. It's going to be the wrong line in query. So we obviously want to optimize it for performance. So what we have done is, in some of our solutions, we pre-cache this data. So the first person that does it, they're going to wait because it's going to take some time, and then we pre-cache it. So the next query, when the second query, consecutive queries come in, when you search by name and a gender, we have all this data. Now, this work for our solution? Will that work for your? Will that work for yours? It depends, because your data is cached. If your system has to be kind of up to date with the changes, maybe you can't cache it for more than a minute. Maybe you can't cache for more than an hour. So there's going to be performance implications, and your functional requirements. You have to really trade, your benefits, what to do when you work with the FHIR server as a facade when you go to those systems. The other thing that is not really shown here, but you also have to kind of know where to direct your query. If I'm searching for patients into this system and maybe my medication needs to go something else, your FHIR server needs to be smart enough to be able to know, oh, wait a second, I'm looking for claims, I need to go to a different system. And then within that system work, okay, can I query the data? Do I need to pre-cache this data? Do I need to do something to kind of fulfill my requirements and adhere to all those implementation guides, shell parameters, if you will. All right, let's see what else we have. Sensitivity of logical patient ID. So this was also very interesting. A lot of times when you build your solutions just like that for smaller clients, you don't encounter what a true full-blown, enterprise information security team might throw at you. So what we have seen in the past is we have. Was there a question? I'm sorry, there was some noise on the line. Okay. What we have seen, what we have encountered was we had a requirement that a patient ID shall not be shared. And what does that mean? So in our case, we had a downstream system that had our patients stored somewhere, and our clinical and the claims for those patients were somewhere else. So when you build your FHIR resources, there's a concept of logical ID that once assigned to that resource, it doesn't ever change. So naturally, we wanted to use just a basic surrogate key from that system and be able to use it as a logical ID. It worked well because it conformed to a spec. So our first attempt was like, okay, we're just gonna get and use that as a logical ID. But the curveball that we got was like a requirement from EIS that you shall not expose that in a plain language. So in that language, but in a plain value. So if my patient ID in my system of truth is 1, 2, 3, 4, we cannot expose this externally as 1, 2, 3, 4. It needs to be something different. So what we have kind of considered for that was, okay, if it was a FHIR-based system that is repository-based, that would be easy because you can take your patient and as you push this data into FHIR server, you can kind of obfuscate. Maybe you can do one-way hash function that can take that 1, 2, 3 and convert it to what I call here 7, 8, 9. It gets persisted in there and it stays there, and it's fine. But it was slightly different for the FHIR server as a facade, which is this diagram here at the bottom. Like the FHIR server as a facade doesn't persist this data, so I couldn't use this approach up top. Like we had to find a different solution, and the solution that we came up with was we kind of obfuscate the patient ID on the fly. So if a patient ID is 1, 2, 3, 4 on the fly, we obfuscate it using somewhat proprietary method, but we obfuscate it. And what's important is we have to persist it. So let's start from the left. If a client is asking for a patient 789, we go and we look at our persistence layer within the FHIR server. We look, okay, 789 externally facing ID. Oh, that was 1, 2, 3, 4 from the downstream system that we got. So it was a one-way function that you can't really reverse it, and you can kind of use your own logic. But the idea was that we had to add a persistence and the obfuscation layer into the FHIR server to be able to really, deliver on this requirement. Because once you obfuscate it and you dish it out to the client, like in this case 789, the client might come back later and be like, hey, can you give me more information about this patient? So they will come back and they will query by that ID. So
You're welcome. No, where was it?
I'm getting some noise in the background. If you guys can go on mute, thank you. Again, going back to here, I got lost a little bit. So the point was that once this patient, in this case, logical patient ID was given to the client, it could never change. So we had to persist it. We had to store it. On our way back, we have to look it up and resolve it. So that's the challenge of a FHIR-based, of the facade FHIR-based server, that if you do it, you're going to encounter sooner or later. So keep that in mind. All right, what's the next one? Forensic data tracking. So this was a very peculiar, and this one is actually not related really to the facade-based system, but in something that we thought it was pretty interesting. So we got a requirement from one of our clients that was like, how can we know if this data that we give as part of the CMS interoperability rule? So if you keep it in a context, and for the CMS interoperability rule, any third party could get access to members' data, to payers' data, as long as they have consent for that third party to get this data. So I could have an application, like let's say I have an ads application and I'm an MNR member, Medicare Advantage member. I can use ads application to get my data. And any payer that is subject to the rule, if I consent, if they verify my identity, they have to give ads application my data so I can see it on my phone. So the question came, what if this information ever leaked, if ads application wasn't safe, it was a breach and something like, how would we know that Lukasz's data that is found somewhere on the internet, actually originated? We know it originated from a payer because it's all payers data, but what was the trail, payer who somewhere else? So we design what we call we call it the watermarking approach. It's not super sophisticated, nor is it foolproof, but it allowed us to kind of get a little bit of those forensic data tracking elements that we could do. So when the FHIR server builds the data and gives it to the third party, to a client, in the resource themselves, we inject some markers. And for the most part, you're going to have to design whether you hash or you encrypt, but you need to put those markers in there. To my earlier point, that it wasn't really foolproof. Like anyone can just take a resource and cut this, piece out if they know where it is. So it was a little bit of what I call secured by obscurity, but it allowed us, and it gave us a little bit of forensic leverage if this data was ever found. So without diving into how we did it for a specific client, you really have two options. You can either do a hash, or you can encrypt something to blob and put it somewhere in your resource and let it just go to that application. Later, if this application gets breached or something, you find this data, you can try to look for those markers and try to kind of decrypt, quote unquote decrypt, who did we give it to, what patient, what application. So if you do it via hash, you obviously have to store this original information. If you do through encryption, you got to make sure that you are able to decrypt it, right? Because you have to keep your key somewhere safe, and what happens when you change those keys. So each one has its own, pros and cons. It really depends on your exact requirements. But I thought this was interesting tidbit that we found in one of our, or not really one, some of our clients that wanted to have this implemented as part of their FHIR server as a facade approaches. All right, let's see other things to consider. So this is the last slide, and I'll just kind of scan through those just to give you guys some ideas that what are specific things for the FHIR server. So because the FHIR server as a facade itself doesn't store the data, you introduce an extra hop to get the data. So I mentioned before, maybe you need to go to a different system to get the claims. Maybe you need to go to a different system to get your clinical data and your patient data. The short of it is you're going to have an extra hop from your server, not to the database, but somewhere else, and who knows where that system has to get the data. So performance-wise, if someone makes a query, let's say a FHIR query that looks for Lukasz's medication, and that query takes 7 seconds to get me my medication by date. Let's say I'm searching for medication or a code. If it takes 7 seconds, the first thing people are going to do is going to hit you because you're at the front end, you as a developer of that survey, and tell you, hey, your server sucks. Took 7 seconds to respond to my query. And then you're going to look into this and be like, wait a second, our part was maybe 300 milliseconds. It was a downstream system that took 6.5 seconds. So lesson learned here is if you build it, make sure you have those tick marks, time marks, whatever you call them, to be able to pinpoint. You got to instrument your code to be quickly able to identify what the root cause is. It's not specific to just FHIR server, but if you're a facade, the first thing people are going to do is knock on your door and tell you that your system doesn't perform. So you better have that at the back of your pocket to be able to deflect and be like, I get it. Give me your ID or whatever. We can look, and then it looks like it's not your system, but it's somebody else's system. That was really helpful for us in the number of incidents that we have seen. What else we have here? Patient identity. This is really applicable to bigger systems. Like when you think about big payers, big organizations, you may have those different pockets of data, like I mentioned, claims, maybe clinical, maybe your, sometimes claims are different, like RX claims are here, medical claims are here. And a lot of times the same patient in those systems have different IDs. So you have an extra complexity to that, patient ID that I was referring to earlier. If somebody is querying for patient 789, okay, how do I translate this to a patient ID in maybe claim system or maybe in clinical system? So if you have a complex system set, if you will, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to figure out, because not only do you have to now kind of maintain the ID to all those systems, but you probably need some kind of a master patient index weaved into your solution to be able to stitch all those things together and be successful in getting the data out of the system that your query wants it from. Again, maybe it's clinical, maybe it's claims, maybe it's something else. And then security, obviously, every system should be secure. The only thing here is really like, when you design your system, we opted out for claims-based authentication. So our clients would first get authorized and authenticated, and a set of claims would be put in a token, that in a barrier token. Word of caution, a lot of what we have seen, people try to put in their claims, they try to put roles rather than rights. And we have seen that it quickly become systems a big pitfall. If you try to do by role, you're better at having those claims in your token. And again, this is not specific to a FHIR server, but this is what we can apply to the FHIR spec, is have those as granular as you can and have them as more rights rather than roles. So maybe medication read, medication write, claim read, claim write, maybe lab order, or have them very granular. You can then kind of bundle them together and build your roles. But if you do it the other way, it's going to be really hard to kind of fulfill on some of your business use cases. So with that, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. I think we burned about half hour, so I don't know, Ed, if this was enough or not
perfect.
enough.
Perfect.
So,
yep. Okay. By the way, before we get going, and Janice has her hands up first, so you're going to be the first question in a moment. If you want to raise your hand, just if you're not familiar with Zoom, click on reactions, and then just click on the button raise hand to be able to ask a question. Take yourself off mute and ask away. Also, there is a clapping hand. And so I promised Lukasz, that he would be the most popular person today at Weedy. So if you can all clap your hands in appreciation right now using that reactions, I'd appreciate it.
All right, you guys are way too nice. Appreciate it, everyone.
You are awesome. I just want to say, I do have a whole page of questions that if we need to have time, that would be great. And nice seeing you again, Sam Rubenstein. I'll get back. Get 1 second. Hey, Janice, you're up first.
All right, so I have 4 questions, so I'll just ask one of them to give other people time, and you can loop back to me if there's time.
Okay.
So on one of the early slides, you mentioned, by the way, this is Janice Karen from the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium. On one of the earlier slides, one of the earlier slides, you mentioned that you thought that a FHIR facade works better for read-only, while repositories work better for read-write support. Can you discuss further why you feel like that's the case, and why, in particular, write is problematic on facades?
It's problematic because the number of systems that you have, you kind of proliferate the problems that you might encounter. So you have to work with all those systems that are your backend, right? Your claims, your clinical, and then when you write, you have to make sure that those systems persisted correctly, and it's persisted in a way that then you can later query it by the logical IDs. For instance, when you put a research, you're going to get the ID back that you can later refer to it. So it feels like it's just a lot coordination. That it's not that it's impossible, but it just feels like you have to have a bigger program. When you own the FHIR server as a repository, you kind of own the database, you own where it is, so you're kind of master of your destiny. So that's what I meant. Like for rights, this one is probably easier to implement. It's not impossible, but I would feel that this is much more easier route to do it than the facade based. Does that help, Janice?
All right. Yep. Thank you. And like I said, if there's time, I'd love to ask you some more questions, but
Absolutely.
I'm not going to monopolize everything.
Yeah, Janice, if you just take your hand down and then put it back up, you'll come back in queue. And then you'll be good for your next question. Sam, it's been a long time. I miss you. You're next. Oh, you're on mute.
Still on mute, Sam.
Okay, give you 5 seconds, Sam. You might have a problem with your computer. We'll come right back to you. We'll let Robert go next, and we'll come right back to you, Sam. Robert.
Great, thanks, Ed. Hey, great presentation, Lukasz. So it seems, I guess going the facade way, if the initial reaction, it's a little bit more cost effective because you don't have to necessarily maintain a physical server, right?
That's correct. So that would be one implication.
Right.
The other one, and maybe that's where you kind of go with your question, is when you create a FHIR server as a repository, you're creating another data island in your organization.
Right.
It may be a problem, maybe it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, the initial, like I said, just seeing it for the first time. So my initial reaction, the facade is great because I can do things real time and get a response back pretty quickly, right? But the disadvantage, from my limited understanding, is that I'm at the mercy of the data that's residing in the peripheral systems, whether structured or unstructured, right? So
that's correct.
Yeah, right. So whereas with the repository server, as you said, I'm the master of that data, right? So I can store it the way I want to store it per standards and have it structured data. And now I can, my sense of accuracy is much more precise, right? Whereas with the facade,
correct. Yep.
because I'm relying on these peripheral systems, I'll go on a pretty high magnitude of effort of trying to create pretty complex algorithms and rules to see that I'm getting the data per the FHIR standards so that I can translate it. And then 6 months down the line, if nobody's really maintaining or managing and getting this thing foundationalized, then I'm back to, modifying and trying to correct my algorithms again and making sure that I'm returning the right accurate data.
Yeah, you will have to. Yeah, in a facade, you always have to work in tandem with those downstream systems from you.
Yeah.
The other disadvantage, or maybe not disadvantage, but the difficulty in the repository, like if your system needs to ingest all this data, claims, clinical, there's a lot of resources.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of overhead that you have to take to be able to ingest it. Not to mention that it's really tricky when you start looking into historical, history of the resources. Loading FHIR server is a task on their own. We actually did 1 or 2 implementations when we took that, and that 90% of our implementations were really facade based. 1 or 2 we did was with facade based, and getting the data into our server from our clients was a big challenge.
Yeah.
The fact of loading it in a performant way and then making sure that everything aligns, it's not trivial. You kind of, when you go with a facade, you don't have to worry about it. You can focus on other things.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. Thank you. I have more questions,
Absolutely.
But I'll circle back with you and Ed afterwards on my additional details.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robert. All right. Hey, before we go to Janice, we do have something in the chat. Leslie, you're welcome to ask the question, or I can ask for you. I know you're not shy. Okay, I'll ask for you. Related to authentication, assuming you're OAuth and OpenID Connect, is that what you're doing?
It depends. It's going to depend on your solution, but yes, for the solutions that we have done, we're relying on OAuth. So we were working with an identity provider, and that identity provider was working with other identity providers, and they were issuing tokens that our server then trusted, right? We look at the signature of the token that came in, and this is where I was referring to, like, we opted going the route of not putting roles in that token, maybe like a nurse roles or a doctor role, more like can read this, cannot write this, or very granular, because then we were bundling those, putting them into the token, and then it was easier to maintain rather than tying ourselves to the roles, rather than the rights, if you will.
Okay, thank you. And reading Leslie, she goes a little more deeper. Also, before I'll ask quickly, UDAP, have you considered using that?
UDAP, that's as far as for registration?
For authentication, registration.
I mean, you can. It really depends. It depends on your solution. So you can. It's kind of like a layer on top of your FHIR server. Yeah.
Okay. Leslie, you're more than welcome to ask some questions directly. Janice, you're next.
All right, great. Janice Karen again. My next question is, if you're using a pre-cache system like the one that you talked about, do you have any recommendations for how long to retain the cache data before updates? Do you use or think that using a system like eTags to know when the data changes helps?
I would. Yeah, that's a good question, because we also kind of looked at what's the balance between performance and resources. So in the context of the rule, the CMS rule at least, right? And I think it was claims had to be refreshed like within a day, or clinical was every 30 days. Gosh, it's been some time, so I forgot. But we kind of look at the business requirements. So if it was that, hey, this data can be stale for a day, we kept it to a day, right? There was no need to make it any better than that. So we kind of look what the rule was, requiring of us, and kind of so what we have to do to stay compliant with the rule.
Gotcha. So Ed, are there other questions, or should I keep going?
One more question, then I'm going to jump in. How about that?
Okay. So I'll skip to my last one. So you talked about the data tagging for where the data was coming from. Don't you have to use FHIR provenance resources for that? Or are you talking about doing something else, like providing the internal location of the data?
You could. Provenance is slightly different. This wasn't really about provenance. This was really about kind of injecting a secret tracker, if you will, right? Your AirTag or whatever. So very, very different approach. So the way we approached it was to kind of put those little tidbits here and there. If that data was ever to be found somewhere else, we had some means to maybe scrub for some insights, like, hey, who did we dish it out in the first place, and if we can kind of follow that trail to figure out why the breach or some kind of a vulnerability was exploited.
All right, thanks. I will pass off to Ed now. Thank you, Ed, for giving me 3 questions.
Oh, sure. You're going to get a 4th in a little bit, so don't worry. Stanley.
Hi, thanks, and thanks for the presentation. Just curious, can you give a rough estimate of the time and the cost of implementing either one of these FHIR server solutions in an entity?
It would be difficult, because it depends on the number of resources that you need. So if I go back, I don't know, maybe which one would be probably the first one. Your cost will grow the moment you have more systems behind the scene here, right? If you have one system that has all your data, that's probably easier. But if you have 6 different systems that store different types of data, maybe it's clinical in one, claims in one, and your formulary somewhere else. But that can even grow. Maybe you have claims that are, medical claims and RX claims somewhere different. So that's going to contribute to your cost, because now you have to, not talk to just one system, but multiple systems. I don't think I would be able to, Stanley, to provide you with like actual cost, because your mileage will vary based on your resources as well, obviously. I know a lot of times people think FHIR is easy, but when you start implementing your FHIR server, that's where, you get into trouble. number of times I had a conversation with people like, oh, I know FHIR. And I'm like, okay, so tell me a little bit about this. Well, I just make the query to the server and it gives me data in FHIR. So that means I know FHIR. Okay, have you ever implemented a FHIR server? No, that's a different conversation, right? So being able to use FHIR as a client and understand how to query maybe and what to look for it is very different than implementing a FHIR server with a reasonable set of capabilities of the FHIR server.
Okay. Lukasz, that's why you're so cool.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and we're going to come back to Janice in a moment. So just curious, publishing your APIs. Assume you have a marketplace, you have somewhere published in the endpoint directory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we do. So our clients, a couple things. Per CMS rule, if we're talking about the rule, every client has to have a public specification. So that is done, but it's kind of manual. What we have done, every FHIR server can produce its own metadata, right? And you can build a FHIR server that doesn't do it, but it's not really a FHIR server. This goes back to my comment that not everybody can build a FHIR server, and we have learned a lot. And part of that is building of your metadata statement about your FHIR server. So there's libraries like Happy and whatnot that greatly help you with this. So your FHIR server produced or has at least the foundational stuff of any given FHIR server. So yes, our FHIR server would be able to give you, kind of set of operations and what you can do with it just by querying that metadata endpoint.
Okay. And now, Lukasz, you don't have to answer this one. This might be confidential. So just tell me no. Just curious, how many app vendors have connected to your interoperability patient access rule?
So I will say there was a good number of applications across our clients that connected. So once the word about the rule got out, many vendors jumped on board and were like, hey, I want to get access to this data.
Yeah.
Naturally, you can imagine that in order for this thing to be meaningful, you have to have a client base, because the fact that you got admitted to a program, that means you may have one patient or maybe two patients. So again, your mileage as a vendor will vary depending how you can market your product and how you can get your users to engage, to pull your data, at least for the CMS rule. You have to keep that in mind.
Right. Are you concerned with having to connect up with other payers and their APIs for payer to payer? And what
I am not, because I represent the vendor, so I can't speak for the payers.
Okay.
So
okay.
from a vendor perspective, as long as controls are in place and legal contracts are in place, and I don't see why not.
All right. Yeah, I was just curious what the lift might be, but we'll have to talk to perhaps your customer then. Janice, I'm going to slip you in.
Actually, I would love to hear Christopher's question answered. Maybe with the caveat of asking if you what you do if the data is incompatible between different IGs.
Sorry, say that again. I missed the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't read the whole question. But Christopher,
yeah, okay.
Do you use a single FHIR server or different servers to cover different IGs? And I would add if the answer is different, or how you handle when the IGs don't have fully compatible data.
No, I'm trying to think how we did it. We don't use multiple servers for different IGs. We actually have one server doing multiple IGs. There was something that we have. There is a way in a FHIR spec, and I just don't remember, that you can query for indicating, I think, an implementation guide. I would have to double check. I don't remember, but I know we did a workaround that we didn't have to have multiple servers. This was not an option to get multiple. There was a way to query a specific. I think it was a profile.
Are you talking about the compatibility statement?
No, it was a way to query, I think, a certain resource based on the profile. You can indicate whether you want it to be profiled this way or that way. It was so long ago, but I know we did something like this, that you could explicitly tell the server to give you a resource for a given using given profile. If there was like, for instance, 2 implementation guides to do the same resource, maybe patient, US core, and maybe, I don't know, Da Vinci something, just making it up. There was a way to, through a FHIR spec, to indicate how you can, I want a FHIR resource filled with the attributes for that particular profile. There is a syntax for it as well.
Gotcha. So, and do you still have time for my other question, or
Sure, go
should
for
I?
it, Janice. I'll follow you.
Okay. So my last question was, when you were talking about the way that you were doing the IDs, isn't there a danger? And maybe this is just because maybe you just did it talked about it very simplistically because you said some of it was proprietary. But isn't there a danger of someone being able to detect the pattern used for transforming the IDs with some type of regular translation mechanism that's repeatable and can go both ways?
Which,
You were talking about the ID transformation because you couldn't let the real patient IDs go beyond.
Oh, this one, yes. So, I mean, let me think about it. So it needs to be transformed in a way that you can reverse it one way or the other. Right. So you either have to be able to reverse it or you have to be able to look it up. I'll just put it this way. Right. Could you use an encryption and have your 1, 2, 3, 4 encrypted to a value that conforms to a FHIR spec and dish it out? You probably could, right? As long as that, and I know we look at encryption. I just don't remember maybe if the number of digits wasn't too long, depending on it. So you could use either. The point here is that you have to be able to reverse it. If you use a one-way hash, you can't reverse it, so you need to persist it. If you use a two-way kind of an encryption or something, then you need to be able to make sure that you never lose your key that you did it with, because if you do, the patient IDs that you dished out, they're gone, and people will start querying for resources that don't exist anymore.
Well, that's what I was worried about. I was worried about someone being able to backtrack and find your pattern.
Correct.
If you're just
I see what
doing...
you say. Yep. So if you do encryption, then you're right. At some point, right, if you have enough and the key isn't long enough, then you potentially are running into the risk that somebody will be able to detect. Now, is the price to get it worth the effort? I don't know. That's probably depending on the situation. And if you use any type of obfuscation one-way hash, that's fairly cryptographically strong that you won't be able to determine what was the original value.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Ed, for indulging me. Back to you.
You're awesome, Janice.
Good question.
I love it. Great questions. Hey, special thanks to Robert Dearly, who's answering some questions online. It's nice to have an expert on chat. So
thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, let's go to Stanley. Oh, sorry.
It appears to me that when you're talking about the facade server, it's the same thing as any translator program at the front end of a system that takes some sort of a message. In this case, it's FHIR, translates it into the native language of the system to get the information, then translates that back into FHIR and sends it back to the client. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct. You got, that's the principle. Yes, it does just that, right? It receives your FHIR query, and then you have to know where to redirect it and what is the protocol that you talk to the backend system, whether it's their custom API or web sub, whatever it is, right? You call that system, and then you get the data back, and then you have to convert it into a FHIR set of resources that you send back as a response to your query.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely.
I have the easiest question of the day for you. Are you willing to share your PowerPoint today?
Absolutely. Yep, I'll send it out. I know you have a version that was probably like 2-3 days old. I made some tweaks, so I will absolutely send it out. There is nothing proprietary in here, so.
Okay, great. I do have a question. Have you perhaps implemented the 3 prior auth APIs yet? And if you haven't, have you made some designs for it?
I'll maybe, I'm gonna say that we are actively working and with the industry to be able to do it. I don't want to commit, based on just commitments to our clients. I would like to keep that confidential, but
Okay, sure.
my group is actively engaged with various Da Vinci groups and the CRD, DTR, and PAS, absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry. And then there's, it's interesting because it's two, you're serving medical policy, right, on the first two, on the CRDTR.
the CRD,
right?
correct.
Right,
Yep.
right. And this,
Yep.
and the DTR is serving up the documentation needs. And then on the other
Correct.
side, you're receiving prior authorization and require, and then there's a status part. And I'm curious,
That's
when
correct.
you're looking at, those sets of APIs and how different they are, I was just curious from the lessons you've learned, is there a different approach you're going to take this time when you're going to pursue this?
I don't think so. It's again, the facade is really like you're not storing, you're just gonna be I really feel like the facade is really the way to go with that policy, because you have every payer has a lot of those utilization management systems behind the scene. So moving all that to a system that can speak FHIR, I think that's just a heavy lift for a lot of organizations. So they're gonna build something that sits in front of it and kind of understand FHIR and can speak to the back end existing APIs, or can tap into those systems in a way that is fairly low cost, relatively low cost, rather than building a brand new, based on FHIR.
I see. Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Rachel, then Stanley.
Thanks, Ed. I just want to say outstanding presentation. Thank you very much. And I just want to make a personal observation. As Ed knows, I've been around the block a few years on this electronic data interchange, going way back to when we got X12 going for medical product supply chain, and then HIPAA. And what you're talking about is conceptually not any different than we did when we were using X12 interfaces and doing X12 exchanges. I worked on 5 interchanging mainframes for many years, for heaven's sakes, before PCs and laptops came along. So this is great concept operationally, and it's just different specifications that we have to use effectively and correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't claim to invent a pattern, right? We just apply it to solve the FHIR world. Absolutely.
Yep. So anyway, high fives. Great presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Hey, Sam Rubenstein, are you still on? See if you can get yourself off mute. Let's take a moment, give you another chance. Okay, well, I tell you, it's 2 minutes until the hour. Lukasz, you're awesome. Just want to say this was the largest emerging technology call so far. So
oh boy,
before you came, people were just anticipating you being awesome, and you were. Okay,
all right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'd be happy to come back if you guys ever want to do something. Feel free to reach out to me. You'll find me easily on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out, send me a message if you need any more details. Be happy to get together and chat.
All right. Thank you so much again. Okay.
All right.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you for everybody for attending. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye.